This evening we're going to speak about Moses and then part 2.
Government. Now Yitro, the priest of Midian, Moshe's father-in-law, heard all about all that God had done for Moshe and for Israel, his people, how Adonai had brought Israel out of Egypt. After Moshe had sent away his wife Zipporah and her 2 sons, Yitro, Moshe's father-in-law, had taken them back. The name of the one son was Gershom, a foreigner there. For Moshe had said, I've been a foreigner in a foreign land. The name of the other was Eliezer. My God helps, because the God of my father helped me by rescuing me from Pharaoh's sword. Yitro, Moshe's father-in-law, brought Moshe's sons and wife to him in the desert, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. The first very obvious thing about this is that Moses did not take his wife along with him to Midian. And obviously there's a question why he did not do that. If one interrogates this a little bit, what actually had happened is that he was a witness to what Yudevavah had done, because he heard of all these marvelous things that had happened to Israel and how Israel had come out of Egypt and how it was Moses that had come out. So because of this witness he heard, he went out to Israel to go and see his son-in-law and to find out what had happened. And with him, he took the stranger, Gershom, because initially it was Moses who was the stranger in the land. But now Gershom had become a stranger to his father. And along with him was his son, who he said, Elohim is my help, God is my help. So these 2 are then his sons. But the important thing to see here is that Yitro heard about this magnificent witness about what had happened in Egypt. And one must understand that Yitro lived quite far away from him. And this had a profound impact on Moses, I'm quite sure, when his wife, 2 sons, and his father-in-law arrived. So the following day, Moshe sat to settle disputes for the people, while the people stood around Moshe from morning till evening. When Moshe's father-in-law saw all that he was doing to the people, he said, what is this that you are doing to the people? Why do you sit there alone with all the people standing around you from morning till evening? Moshe answered his father-in-law, it's because the people come to me seeking God's guidance. Whenever they have a dispute, it comes to me. I judge between one person and another and explain to them God's laws and teachings. Moshe's father-in-law said to him, what you're doing isn't good. So we need to interrogate what is happening here exactly. And what is happening here exactly is the following. He said, so listen now to what I have to say to you. I will give you some advice, and Elohim will be with you. You should represent the people before God, and you should bring their cases to God. You should also teach them the laws and the teachings and show them how to live their lives and what work they should do. But you should choose from among all the people competent men who are God-fearing, honest, and incorruptible to be their leaders in charge of thousands, hundreds, 50s, and 10. Normally, they will settle the people's disputes. They should bring you the difficult cases, but ordinary matters they should decide for themselves. In this way, they will make it easier for you and share the load with you. If you have a leader over 1,000, you will have 2 leaders over 500. So the leader over 1,000 actually is the leader over 2, but through the 2, he is governing the rest. And this starts making some interesting teaching, because when Jethro speaks, he said 1,000, and then he says 100. So a leader of 1,000 is a leader over 10 times 100. But elsewhere in the scripture, you find that there is a leader over 500 as well. So this is where 1 to 2 then comes in. And then when one interrogates that a little bit further, a leader over 50 is a leader of over 5 people who are each leading 10 people. And then the next part of the structure is, so this is what Moses' father-in-law was saying. He was saying there's a leader of over 1,000, then there's and he is a leader over 10 leaders over 100. And if one puts the leader over 500 in there, you actually have a leader over 1, and you have that leader over 2, and the leader over 2 is the leader over 500 is the leader over 5 leaders over 100 each. There's 1 person with 2 and 2 people with 5. Now let's just look at the next level of the structure. So there's leader over 1,000, a leader over 500, the leader, 5 leaders over 1 leader over 5 leaders over 100, and then 1 leader over 100 is a leader over 2 leaders over 50, and a leader over 50 is a leader over 5 leaders over 10. So you see this pattern. This leader, who then eventually becomes this leader as well, he deals only with 2. Those 2 each deal with 5. This guy deals with 2. That guy deals with 5. And then if you look at the structure that was there for Yeshua, Yeshua was the leader, and he spoke mainly to John and Peter, Yohanan and Kepha. And through John and Peter, he also spoke to the rest of the 12, because obviously he was leading all 12. And this actually means that he had a leadership structure of his own in place, which was also 1, which was him, 2, which was Peter and John, and 5 each, which were the other 10 disciples. So if you look at this structure very carefully, he was teaching these 2. Those 2, along with him, were teaching these 5. So he was teaching 6 in this group, and he was teaching 6 in that group. So that means that everyone was in a situation where they could intensely discuss what was happening. And this is the ideal structure for leadership. As a result of this, I had a very interesting experience. So you have 1 leader over 2, 2 leaders over 5. And then the next thing that happens is at one stage I went to Israel, and the president of Israel said, I am the leader of a nation of presidents. So if you want to know what the leadership structure of the church should look like, this is what it looks like. As you know, this is the Star of David, and it's the sign of Israel. Because if you look at this, everyone is speaking to everyone. And in the middle of this is the true leader. And the true leader is Yeshua. So if that leadership structure looks like this, it is 6, which is the number of man. With Yeshua in the middle, it is the number of God. And actually, in the Jewish sense, they put a chet and a yud in there, which actually says chai, which means life. And Yeshua is the life. So he's the life of this entire leadership structure. Now let's just go a little bit further. So you have 1,000, 10 over 100, 100, 2 times 2 over 50, and 50, 5 over 10, and then that we get to the 1, 2, 5 structure again. So if you do this, and God is directing you to do it, you will be able to endure. And all these people too will arrive at their destination peacefully. Look at Jethro's humility. He's saying to him, I'm suggesting this to you. But if God is directing you, in other words, go find out from God whether this is correct. And then Moshe paid attention to his father-in-law's counsel and did everything he said. Moshe chose competent men from all Israel and made them heads over the people in charge of hundreds, thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. As a general rule, they settled the people's disputes. The difficult cases they brought to Moshe, but every simple matter they decided for themselves. But see, this is more than just a judgment structure, because this also creates a structure for Moses to teach all the people and to make very sure that everyone is well taught. Because he taught 2, each of those 2 taught 5, each of those 5 taught 2, each of those 2 taught 5. So eventually what happens, if anyone has a question, then he goes to the next level leader, finds out if he can answer him, and if he can, then he just distributes it into the leadership structure of which he is part. But if it goes all the way to Moses, it actually goes right through the whole leadership structure of the entire Israel. Because understand, the scriptures for Moses for Israel are the law. And the law is the 5 books of Moses. So it's actually creating an incredible opportunity for everyone, because everyone learns at one place and everyone is taught at a second place. This is what this whole thing is about. But Jethro says, as Elohim commands you. So Moses heard from Elohim and accepts the counsel humbly, and is prepared to consider another person's revelation. And this is the sign of a true leader. He will consider other people's revelations. He will go to God and find out from God whether they're correct, and he will then follow them. So if we look at the leadership structure that exists at the moment in the church, it is skewed a little bit, because every pastor should have people helping him, and at every level there should be people helping those people. So you see, because this is what the leadership structure should look like, it actually means that the church should function very well in small groups, and that the churches get together on a regular basis at all, because you know that Paul said that we must not neglect the gatherings. So there need to be gatherings, and there also needs to be this structure, so that one can be very sure that everyone knows what comes from God.
This means no gathering was ever going to be more than 11 people.
No, 13. 2 groups of 6 and the leader. But remember, there are also the feasts and there are also the Sabbaths, and these are days of gathering. So this means that this is the structure actually outside of the usual gathering structure. Although it says 1,000, 100, 50, and 10. Just remember, in another place we read about a leader over 500. And then in Yeshua's case, it was Yeshua with the 12, and he had 2. He had Peter and John. He always taught everyone, but he often had Peter and John on their own. So he was actually grooming them to be leaders. And this is the mark of a great leader, because a great leader is never a high tree that doesn't allow any grass to grow under it. It is a leader who actually nurtures people to become leaders, and he sends them out to deal with the rest.
The learning and the right ruling happened on a very intimate basis, not standing in front of 60,000 and speaking over loudspeakers.
That was right ruling. But then there were also the meetings, because there were the 3 yearly meetings at the temple, because they had to go to the temple for Passover, for Shavuot, which is Pentecost, and also for Sukkot, which is the Feast of Booths.
Yes.
So that those 3 occasions, there was a massive gathering.
Yeah, I mean, it could be 1 million or more.
It could, 6 million, 12 million, whatever. But the entire structure broken down into groups of 2 and 6.
Because, you know, Nehemiah, when they for the first time opened the Torah, after they rebuilt the wall and they haven't read the Torah for such a long time, we read that Nehemiah and Ezra was reading out aloud on a little platform that they built. And the Levites and the priests went amongst the people and taught them. Everybody was standing still. Nobody moved around or went away or nothing.
Yes.
And I always wondered how that was possible. They were 73,000 people, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
But I'm beginning to think that what Bible doesn't tell us, but possibly even at that Nehemiah gathering, they had a structure like this in place. That is how the Levites and the priests were able to teach in a mass of 73,000 people by moving amongst the people.
When the Levites are actually appointed to teach the people by Moshe, there's a count of the Levites and there's a count of the firstborn, and it was about the same. So this actually meant that every family had its own Levite. Moshe went up to Elohim and Adonai called to him from the mountain. Each time you see the word Elohim, you see it's the word God. Each time you see the word Adonai, it is Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And this is a very important distinction because the word Elohim actually can mean many judges, many magistrates. When he went up to the judge and magistrate, Adonai, I am. So this I am is I exist, which is a much softer, this is God's title. This is his character. And he called him to the mountain. Here's what you to say to the household of Yaakov, to tell the people of Israel. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you will pay careful attention to what I say and keep my covenant, then you will be my own treasure from among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you will be a kingdom of Kohanim, of priests for me, and nations set apart. These are the words you are to speak to the people of Israel. Moshe came, summoned the leaders of the people of Israel, of the people, and presented them with these words which Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh had ordered him to say. All the people answered as one. Everything Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, I am, our loving God has said, we will do. Moshe reported the words of the people to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. So Elohim reminds Israel here that you must listen. Now, if you will pay careful attention to what I say, not what the laws are, what I say. So the entire Israel was supposed to hear his voice and keep his covenant. He's actually saying, I will explain my covenant to you when I talk to you. Then you will be my treasure from among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. For you will be a kingdom of priests who hear and obey, and then Israel undertakes to do. So they are now following the faith of Abraham. Moses went up to God, and God called to him, Adonai called to him from the mountain. Moses goes up and down the mountain. Adonai says to Moshe, see, I'm coming to you in a thick cloud so that the people will be able to hear when I speak with you and also to trust in you forever. Moshe had told Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh what the people had said. So Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh said to Moshe, go to the people today and tomorrow separate them for me by having them wash their clothing and prepare for the third day. For on the third day, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh will come down on Mount Sinai before the eyes of all the people. You are to set limits for the people all around and say, be careful not to go up on the mountain and even touch its base. Whoever touches the mountain will surely be put to death. No hand is to touch him, for he must be stoned or shot by arrows. Neither animal nor human will be allowed to live. When the shofar sounds, they may go up on the mountain. Here is Moses, and he goes up the mountain. And the first thing that the Lord says to him, he says, look, I'm going to speak to you. The people will be able to hear. So he's saying to the nation, I'm going to speak, and it's going to be a bit of a noise, because you'll be able to hear. Where I speak to Moses on the mountain, you will hear at the bottom. And then obviously what happened here is Moses goes up the mountain and goes down the mountain. And then he says, wash their clothing. So wash their clothing, that has a very direct connection to the book of Revelations, because in chapter 7 there is a great multitude that appears before the Lamb and before the throne, and the elder then asks Yochanan or John, who are these? And then John says, you know. In other words, I don't have a cooking clue. And then he says, these are those who washed their clothes in the blood of the Lamb. But they're in white clothes. So that actually means that they are to become holy and prepare for the third day. Why the third day? Remember, they had to go into the desert for 3 days to go and make a sacrifice. Because when Yeshua was sacrificed, it was 3 days and 3 nights. Then he was resurrected from the dead. And on the third day, Yudevave will come down on Mount Sinai before the eyes of all the people. So this is actually resurrection. So he says, go and prepare yourselves, become holy, and I will resurrect you. Becoming holy means to repent of your sin, dying to your sin, and you are to set limits for the people all around and say, be careful not to go up on the mountain and even touch its base. Whoever touches the mountain will surely be put to death. No hand is to touch it, for he must be stoned or shot by arrows. Neither animal nor human will be allowed to live. When the shofar sounds, they may go up on the mountain. If someone touches the mountain, he has touched the holiness of God. And he actually may not be touched, because whoever is touching him is touching the holiness of God. Why? Because the nation is to live in holy fear of God. Moses goes up and down the mountain again to go and bring this message. He said to the people, prepare for the third day. Don't approach a woman. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder, lightning, and a thick cloud on the mountain. Then a shofar blast sounded so loudly that all the people in the camp trembled. Moshe brought the people out of the camp to meet Elohim. They stood near the base of the mountain. Mount Sinai was enveloped in smoke because Adonai descended onto it in fire. Its smoke went up like the smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain shook violently. So he's saying, when you prepare to meet with me, you are not to be intimate with your wife, because you have to be intimate with me. And this is a very intense thing that is being said here, because he's saying that the intimacy between me and Israel is to be the same as the intimacy of a man with a woman. There is a thick cloud on the mountain. And this thick cloud, according to what the rabbis tell us, actually formed a covering over the people. This covering over the people, because they were his bride, actually was what the Jews call a talit, because they spread out a cloth between 4 staves, and that is actually a prayer shawl. And the prayer shawl is a symbol of the Spirit. And from the corners of the prayer shawl, the edges hang. Those are those fronds of string that are on the corners of this. And they hang from there, and they actually represent the Torah. So the Torah depends on the Spirit. And there he says it again. And then this means that he was marrying Israel when this happened. And Moshe brought the people out of the camp to meet Elohim, and they stood at the base of the mountain. So he went and he brought the people under the marriage cloud. Sinai was enveloped in smoke because Adonai descended onto it in fire, and its smoke went up like the smoke from a furnace, because that oven has everything to do with Abraham. When God moved between the two halves of those animals and made a covenant with Israel, it was a smoking pot. And then there also was a fiery brand that went along with it. But let's just look at this smoking pot, because this smoking pot was actually happened when the Lord promised Israel that Abraham would have a great descendants. So here, God is actually meeting with Abraham's descendants, and again he's saying, you are to me as a smoking pot. In other words, you're going to multiply and become the nation of Israel. And as you know, through Abraham, the nations were to be blessed as through Israel. So he said, do not lie with a woman, relate only to Yudhe-Vaveh, and that pot is the same pot as Abraham's pot. So as the sound of the shofar grew louder and louder, Moshe spoke, and Elohim answered him with a voice. Adonai came down onto Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain. Then Adonai called Moshe to the top of the mountain. So here he goes up the fourth time, and Moshe went up. Adonai says to Moshe, go down and warn the people not to force their way to Adonai to see him. If they do, many of them will perish. Even the Kohanim or priests who are allowed to approach Yudhe-Vaveh must keep themselves holy. Otherwise, Yudhe-Vaveh will break out against them. Moshe said to Yudhe-Vaveh, the people can't come up to the Mount Sinai because you ordered us to set limits around the mountain and separate it. But Yudhe-Vaveh answered him, get down, then come back up, you and Aaron with you. But don't let the Kohanim and the people force their way through to come up to them, Adonai, or he will break out against them. So Moshe went down to tell the people and told them. So what happens? Up and down the mountain again. So this is the fifth time. And this time he goes and he warns the people again not to come close to the mountain because there are limits there. And then he says, you come up here and bring Aaron with me. And then Moses obviously did this. So up and down the mountain. Then all the people experienced the thunder, the lightning, the sound of the shofar, and the mountain smoking. When the people saw it, they trembled. Standing at a distance, they said to Moshe, you speak with us and we will listen, but don't let God speak with us or we will die. Moshe answered the people, don't be afraid, because God has come to test you and make you fear him, so that you won't commit sins. So the people stood at a distance, but Moshe approached the thick darkness where God was. And down the mountain, sixth time. All the people experienced this thunder, the lightning, the sound of the shofar, and the mountain smoking. You know, when the Holy Spirit was poured out on Israel on the day of Pentecost, that was the day of Shavuot. According to the rabbinic teachings, this happened on the day of Shavuot, which is the harvest festival, bringing in the nations to Yudhe-Vaveh. So his relationship with Israel is meant to multiply him into the nations. But then they do something that was not that good, and they said, you speak to us and we will listen, but don't let Elohim speak with us or we will die. And then he says, don't be afraid so that you won't commit sins. And we know that the role of the Spirit, the role of God himself in us, is to help us to have victory over our sin and our unrighteousness. So the people stood at a distance, but Moshe approached the thick darkness where Elohim was. Can you see the thing that is repetitively happening? again, the nation is refusing to listen to God himself and is living in fear of him. This means that they cannot hear from God personally, and that they had to hear from God through Moses. The purpose was exactly this, and the voice then addresses sin. So then he gives the 10 Commandments.
I just want to ask, why did God make the people at Mount Sinai, making them to fear, to tremble, and the people as eventually said to Moses that you yourself speak to God on our behalf. We cannot speak to God. Why was that? Was it because of sin, or was it because of what was happening in Mount Sinai?
You see, Moses went up and down the mountain, and he told them God was going to speak to them. So they heard from the mountain that God was speaking. And obviously it was a very loud sound. And that is why they were afraid. It's because God spoke to them. But Moses prepared them. And he actually said, you need to hear God speak. And then they refused to have him speak directly to them. Moses had already told them, God will speak to you. And then they refused. And that was not good.
Isn't there also the possibility that firstly, what was in their hearts as they listened to God affected how they heard him and how they experienced him? If in their hearts they were unwilling to accept his authority, then his voice would have been very threatening to them. In Moses' case, that could not happen because he was basically saying, I'm not going anywhere without you. He was not afraid. He was asking for God to be with him. I'm thinking as I listened to Martha's question that maybe they all heard the same voice, but because of what was in their hearts, what they experienced was very different.
You're actually bringing forth a very interesting question, because in Judaism they say there are always two rabbis in a generation. One for the fear of God and one for the love of God. And the one thing that comes out of this is that God is actually saying to Israel, you really need to fear me because I am incredibly, incredibly powerful. But at the same time, he was also saying to them, I love you so incredibly that I want to speak to you. And they didn't hear the balance. They didn't hear the loving God. And he was not very happy with that because he had taken them through the Red Sea. He had given them water in the desert. He had given them manna in the desert. He had taken care of them. He had brought them to Sinai. And now they don't want to listen to him. So that must have been very terrible to him because they must have known this is an extremely powerful God. But this extremely powerful God wants only good things for you. So learn this. You need to hear this voice, but you need to hear that this voice might be totally quiet, but this voice is a mighty voice that should make you fear. So this is the whole thing that went wrong with Adam and Eve. They didn't live in the fear of this voice.
Because of rebellion.
Well, we will never know whether it was rebellion or whether it just simply was that they considered him too lightly.
Today, the church doesn't experience this Mount Sinai thing, like what has happened at Mount Sinai. They heard the thunder, they heard God speaking to Moses.
Look, the reason why that has happened is because God did this once in history. And there is a rule in Israel. That is that every Jew is to consider himself as though he was at Sinai when this happened. Oh. So all of us are supposed to consider ourselves as though we were at Mount Sinai when the law was given. So we must know that God speaks with an incredibly loud voice. But then we also know that he speaks to us with an incredibly silent voice. But we need to know that those two voices are the same voice. the voice of fear and the voice of love. And we hear only the voice of love. And it was not intended for this to be repeated.
Meaning every day as we read the word, we hear the word, we should be like it's happening now. It has not happened then. Now it's happening as we are speaking now. It's like now we are at Mount Sinai.
Yes.
Meaning you don't have to make Bible a history book. Eh?
Yes. It actually means that when we hear him speak, we should picture him at Mount Sinai. But then we must also hear Shaul or Paul saying, you must pray continuously. Prayer is when people talk to God and God talks to people. There is only one part of prayer that really has power. That is not me talking to God. It is God talking to me, because he said he will be a comforting counselor. So he will walk alongside us every second of every day, and he will tell us what the righteous thing is to do in each situation. And then, if we do sin in spite of that, he's going to say to us, you sinned. And immediately you will know what I did is wrong, and you need to ask for forgiveness for that. Next time, you are going to be busy sinning, and he's going to say, what are you doing? And he expects you to ask forgiveness immediately, also from those you are sinning against, because it is a rule. You cannot go and ask forgiveness for your sins from God. You first have to go to the person against whom you have sinned. Understand, David sinned against Uriah.
Yes.
He killed Uriah. So could he ask forgiveness of him? No. Therefore, he said, I sinned against you alone. Not because he didn't acknowledge that he had sinned against Uriah. So you see, this God who is so incredibly loving is so incredibly powerful, and we must never forget this. So Yudevave said to Moshe, here is what you are to say to the people of Israel. You themselves have seen that I spoke from you from heaven. You are not to make for me gods of silver, nor are you to make gods of gold for yourselves. For me, you will need to make only an altar of earth, and you will sacrifice your burnt offerings, peace offerings, sheep, goats, and cattle. In every place where I cause my name to be mentioned, I will come to you and bless you. He said, I spoke to you from heaven. You saw my power. You saw how incredibly big I am. Don't make gods for you. You can make an altar of earth, because what you are to do at this altar of earth is you are to take an animal, confess your sins over it. That animal becomes as though it is you, and you cut that animal's throat. So you're cutting your own throat and killing yourself because of your sin, because you are dying into the Messiah to be resurrected to new life, to get victory over that sin. And therefore, if we're not experiencing continual victory over our sin, we need to ask ourselves, do we have the Spirit in us? And that has an implication, because we should actually be baptized again if we don't. So here this is just explained again. The altar's purpose is Israel must sacrifice. The hand on the animal's head transmits sin. You slaughter the animal, collect your blood. The animal becomes yourself, its own death to sin, and that's your own blood that you are taking to the altar to atone. Obviously, there's something else that is in this, and you can see this very clearly. When you put your hand on the hand of the animal, you should be dying. So the animal that you are killing represents Yeshua, who is dying for your sin. And even for them, it meant the same, because he is the lamb that was slaughtered before the foundation of the earth. And he was giving them a picture of him. Moshe went up onto the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain 6th time. Okay, the other one was the 5th time. The glory of Adonai stayed on the Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. On the 7th day, he called to Moshe out of the cloud. To the people of Israel, the glory of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh looked like a raging fire on the top of the mountain. Moshe entered the cloud and went up on the mountain. He was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So we all think that these Israelites were terrible people because Moshe is just up the mountain for 40 days. But what would you have thought if your leader was up on the mountain and there's fire there? You would have thought the fire is going to kill him. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh looked like a raging fire. But Moshe did not die. And he did not die because he dealt with his sin and his unrighteousness. And he was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. This associates 40 with the Torah. 40 is the number of the Torah. So when you disrespect the Torah, as Israel did when they murmured against God, he is going to give you 40 years to repent of it. Moses went into the desert and he was there for 40 years. When the flood came over the earth, it rained for 40 days. When Yeshua went to fast, he fasted for 40 days. There are 40 days between Passover and Ascension. So you see, that actually is this number of the Torah all the time coming into it. And then the Jews say that the day that all of this happened is the day of Shavuot. It's the day of Pentecost. It's the day of the outpouring of the Spirit. And there was fire on top of the mountain. And there was fire on the top of every one of the disciples' heads. So he was actually pouring out on them the law, but the law of the Spirit and not the law of Sinai, which was a book. Because the law of Sinai went to the people and they used it as a book. God intended it to be it is the maker's manual. It is the manual for how we are to live. Moses is on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights in Elohim's presence. There is a consuming fire which is to destroy sin, and it is a fiery empowerment for Moses' ministry. When the people saw that Moshe was taking a long time to come down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Get busy and make us gods to go ahead of us, because this Moshe, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him. He's burnt up on the mountain, and you can see that fire up there. He's been up there 40 days and 40 nights, so he's not going to come back. We need gods to take us, to go ahead of us." So they're saying two things here. They're saying that Moses is their God, and the second thing they're saying is, make us gods. Aaron said to them, "Have your wives, sons, and daughters strip off their gold earrings and bring them to me." And look what God does here prophetically. He strips off their gold earrings because they are listening to the other voice. They're listening to the voice of Satan. God's voice said, "Do not make an idol." And here they decide to make an idol. So he strips the gold off their ears. And God is actually saying to them, you should be hearing. Your ears are ears of gold and they cannot hear. He received what they gave him, melted it down and made it into the shape of a calf. They said, "Israel, here is our God who brought us up from the land of Egypt." On this, Aaron built an altar in front of it and proclaimed, "Tomorrow is to be a feast for..." Look, we usually read the word "the Lord" here, but that is not the correct word. This word here is Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. So Aaron was acting in fear of the people, and he knew what he was doing was wrong. And he said this needs to be a feast for Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. But you see what he did. You can clearly see what he did wrong. over here. They question Moses' life. They make a golden calf for an idol. They build the altar. They don't have idols, but they make an idol. And then they build an altar for that altar, and they call it an altar for God. Adonai continued speaking to Moshe. I've been watching these people, and you can see how stiff-necked they are. Now leave me alone so that my anger can blaze against them and I can put an end to them. I will make a great nation out of you instead. Moshe pleaded with Adonai his Elohim. He said, Adonai, why must your anger blaze against your own people you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and a strong hand? Yet the Egyptians say it was with evil intentions that he led them out, to slaughter them in the hills and wipe them off the face of the earth. Turn from your fierce anger. Relent. Don't bring such disaster on your people. Remember Avraham, Yitzchak, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your very self. You promised them, I will make your descendants as many as the stars in the sky, and I will give all this land I have spoken about to your descendants, and they will possess it forever. So he says to Moses, I'll make of you a great nation. And then he says, God, please, remember Abraham. And he uses the name Abraham, the father of multitudes. Remember the father of multitudes. Through these people, you're intending to reach the earth. Please don't wipe them off the face, because the Egyptians would say that you had evil intent over them. Remember Yitzchak. Remember laughter. Remember this boy that was born from a barren woman and a man who was not worth very much. And remember Israel. And he's not saying Jacob. He's saying Israel. Because he said, I made you Jacob and I formed you Israel. Now, Jacob means ankle grabber, because Ekev means ankle, and Yaakov means ankle grabber, because he grabbed the ankle of Esau and wanted to be first. And then he said, I formed you Israel. So I made you a cheat to start off with, but then I transformed you. And this word, Israel, means Prince of God, your servants to whom you swore by your very self. You promised them, I will make your descendants as many as the stars in the sky. I will give them all this land I have spoken about to your descendants, and they will possess it forever. So he's saying to the Lord, you remember that flaming pot and the fiery torch of Abraham? Remember that burning furnace on top of the mountain? You were promising to make them that. How can you wipe them out? And then he said, this is not good. Please do not do this. And then the next thing happens. Yudhe tests Moses and says he can become the father of faith. But Moses does not want this, because he pleads for Israel for Yudhe sake and not about him. This is the first time that God brings a man of faith to the fore, who is not only about bringing that man of faith so that there can be descendants, but he brings a man of faith who will lead a nation to their destiny. And this is a very mighty thing that he's saying. And Moshe turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands, tablets inscribed on both sides, on the front and on the back. The tablets were the work of Elohim, and the writing was the writing of Elohim, engraved on the tablets. When Joshua heard the noise of the people shouting, he said to Moshe, it sounds like war in the camp. He answered, there is neither clamor of victory nor the wailings of defeat. What I hear is the sound of people singing. But the moment Moshe got near the camp, he saw the calf and the dancing. His own anger blazed up, and he threw down the tablets he had been holding and shattered them at the base of the mountain. So this was a marriage ceremony. He went up onto the mountain and he went to fetch the tablets. The tablets were actually the marriage contract between God and Israel. In Hebrew, it is known as a ketubah. Moses had no choice. He had to make the marriage contract zero. He had to annul it. And the way to annul it was to destroy the marriage contract. So this is not what we usually thought. Moses got so terribly angry and he broke the tablets. No, he was divorcing Israel and God from each other. And that is an incredible, powerful thing. He takes the tablets with him from the cloud, from the marital chuppah, the tablets of the marriage contract, and he breaks the contract to save Israel. Moshe stood at the entrance to the camp and shouted, "Whoever is for Yudevave, come to me." All the descendants of Levi rallied around him. He told them, "Here is what Yudevave, the Elohim of Israel, says. Each of you put his sword on his side and go up and down the camp from gate to gate, and every man is to kill his kinsman, his own friend, and his own neighbor." The friends of Levi did what Moshe said, and that day 3,000 people died. Moshe said, "You have consecrated yourself today to Yudevave, because every one of you has been against his own son and his own kinsman, in order to bring a blessing on yourselves today." The next day, Moshe said to the people, "You have committed a terrible sin. Now I will go up to Yudevave, and maybe I will be able to atone for you. The life of an animal is in the blood, and the blood will atone for you on the altar." So you must understand what is happening here. These 3,000 people here that died, their blood is atonement for what Israel had done. They died in the place of Israel. So in a very specific way, they were a symbol of Yeshua, who drew all the sin of the people onto him. These 3,000 actually drew the sin of the entire Israel onto them. And then he says, "I will go and atone for your sin." With which blood is he going to atone? It must be the blood of those who fell in sin. Moshe went back to Adonai and said, "Please, these people have committed a terrible sin. They made themselves a god of gold. And if you will just forgive their sins, but if you won't, then I beg you, blot me out of your book which you have written." Yudevave answered them, "Those who have sinned against me are the ones I will blot out of my book. Now go and lead the people to the place I've told you about. My angel will go ahead of you. Nevertheless, the time for punishment will come, and then I will punish them for their sin." So Moses is now doing what Adam did not do. Moses is saying, "Blot me out of the book, but save them." Adam could have done that. He could have said, "Blot me out and save her." And Yeshua eventually came and he said, "Blot me out and save everyone." So God says, "Those who sinned against me are the ones I will blot out of my book." And then he says, "Now go ahead and lead the people to the place I told you about. My angel will go ahead of you. Nevertheless, the time for punishment will come, and then I will punish them for their sin." So he says, "My angel will go ahead of you." And as we've previously seen, his angel always speaks on God's behalf. He speaks as though he is God. So the angel of God is God himself. And the angel is visible. God himself is invisible. And no one has seen the Father but the Son. He has seen the Father, has seen the Son. So the angel who goes ahead actually is Yeshua. He's going to go back to Yudevave with his life for them. But the Elohim says, "I will punish the sinners." And his angel accompanies, who is Yeshua, who eventually dies for all sinners. Moshe said to Adonai, "Look, you say to me, make these people move on, but you haven't let me know whom you will be sending with me. Nevertheless, you have said, I will know you by name, and also you have found favor in my sight. Now, please, if it is really the case that I have found favor in your sight, Show me your ways so that I will understand you and continue finding favor in your sight. Moreover, keep seeing this nation as your people. He answered, set your mind at rest. My presence will go with you. After all, Moshe replied, if your presence doesn't go with us, don't make us go up from here. For how else is it to be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people, other than by going with us? That is what distinguishes us, me and your people, from all the other peoples of the earth. Now the presence of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is called the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah is that which rested on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. So God himself was present as the Shekhinah. Once again, this is a visible God who is there. So it was Yeshua, the visible God, who accompanied them through the desert. And he says, I will cause all my goodness to pass before you, and in your presence I will pronounce the name of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. Moreover, I will show my favor to whomever I will, and display mercy to whoever I will. But my face you cannot see, because a human being cannot look at me and remain alive. Here he said, is a place near me. Stand on the rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you inside a crevice in the rock and cover you with my hand until you have passed by. Then I will remove my hand and you will see my back, but my face is not to be seen. I will cause all my goodness to pass before you. So he protects Moses from himself and plans to be seen from behind, but not his face. And he conceals him in a crevice, in a crack in the rock. So what's happening here? He says that Yeshua is the rock that accompanied them through the desert. So this is, he's putting, Eve was born from Adam's side, and the bride was born from Yeshua's side when blood and water poured out, because it was his life and the spirit that was poured out of him, his life that atoned, and his spirit that brings life. Then Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and he passed in front of Moshe, proclaiming Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, El, compassionate and gracious Elohim, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. God is actually showing his character here. He's telling Israel what righteousness is. And he says, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, the God who judges without compassion at the fall of sin, the judge who judges with compassion when the priest enters behind the drape with the blood of goats and steers. And he is God, so he is almighty. There is nobody greater than him. He is the power behind that voice. He's compassionate and he's gracious. So he loves with an unending love, a love of which the purpose is love alone, and a love that puts himself at the same level as us, not being compassionate from above, but being compassionate from within us, and gracious, showing us grace. He's slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. This faithfulness, actually, the Hebrew word is emet. And emet means truth. So that he means that everything that he promised, he will do. Maintaining love to thousands. Those who love him, he will continue to love to this 1000th generation. And he forgives wickedness. Wickedness is sin committed with intent. So it is sin that is committed knowing that this is sin. It is rebellion. And rebellion is sin. It is just plain rebellion against God. And this is satanic. And when he says sin, it is sin that is committed without intent. When you sin without knowing, he forgives that. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. But see, he forgives. So those who have been forgiven are not guilty anymore. And he punishes those who do not ask forgiveness when they know they have sinned. And he punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. Because we, as the children of our fathers, do what our fathers did. And they, as children of their fathers, did what their fathers did. And we're so used to doing this terrible stuff that we consider it normal. But he punishes it to the children and their children. Why? Not because he's punishing you because of what your grandfather did, but because you are doing what your grandfather did. You should read from the law that it is sin, and you should get rid of it. And then he says, but in the third or fourth generation, the penny will drop, and you will see that you have sinned. So this is the righteousness of God that he expects of us. When Moshe came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, he didn't realize that the skin of his face was sending out rays of light as a result of his talking with Yudevave. When Aaron and the people of Israel saw Moshe, the skin of his face was shining, and they were afraid to approach him. But Moshe called to them. Then Aaron and all the community leaders came back to him, and Moshe spoke to them. Afterwards, all the people of Israel came near, and he passed on to them all the orders that Yudevave had told him on the Mount Sinai. But they couldn't take this shiny face, because it was the fire on the mountain. And once Moshe had finished speaking with them, he put a veil on their face. And this veil still exists until today, because the reflection of God's glory is too much. And this veil that they pulled over Moshe's face is the veil that makes they cannot see who Yeshua is.
As I listen to you, and you've often told us how humble Moshe was, how many of us would have been willing to run up and down a mountain almost as a messenger boy between Elohim and the nation, just because the nation did not want to listen to God themselves? I count that he's gone up 7 times, and that in fact the 5th time, when he got the first set of tablets, he was there for 40 days. And during that 40 days, Abba gave him all the instructions for the tabernacle and everything else. That's why he was up there for 40 days. He didn't lie down and sleep. Then the 6th time that he goes up, he actually goes to atone for the nation. And the 7th time he goes up, he goes for the 2nd set of tablets, and guess what? He's there again for 40 days. There's something very, very special about this 40 days every time Abba gives him the set of tablets.
40 is the number of Torah.
I've been asking myself so many times that why were the people stubborn? I mean, they've been through so much, but they were stubborn, disobedient. I don't know, what do you think? Can we share that perhaps?
Yeah, I think it's rather obvious from what happens, because each time they come to a point where they have hardship, and each time they have hardship, they start grumbling and they complain against Moses. Moses tells them, you should be complaining to God. We have to put ourselves in the same situation. Moses knows God so intimately because for 40 years he was taught by God in the desert. But they did not know God that intimately. So it was easy to believe that there is going to be a miracle. And then when the miracle doesn't happen, they say, it won't happen, it will never happen. And that's exactly what we do. So we're no different. We're exactly the same. At least I'm exactly the same. I turned my back on faith. Well, I was an elder in the church, but I actually was not a believer at all. I went from my 4th year as a medical student until 1985, which was 17 years. I turned my back on the Lord. So, you know what? I'm pretty stubborn myself, so I shouldn't criticize Israel.